You're listening to the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
We think we're modern because we couch everything that's going on in other terms. We use words like choice, hookups, friends with benefits, women's health, or even the word love. But when the word love is used, they're using the Greek word eros, which means sexual love. They're not using the word agapeo or phileo, which is love no matter what, or brotherly love. They're not using that.
There is power in specific word choice. There's a reason that many political agendas are adamant about the language they choose to use. For instance, one side may call it abortion, while the other may call it reproductive rights. The use of language in politics is designed to rally people behind an idea. In today's message, Pastor Ken teaches that for many people today, this specific language is often an attempt to justify their actions. Language has power, but your actions have far more power. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Isaiah, chapter 57, as he begins his message, Breaking Really Bad.
We're still in Isaiah 57, and we're not breaking bad tonight, we're breaking really bad. But God's grace still exists, okay? But that gives you a hint, because if anybody knows anything about that TV show, this is really bad stuff. I mean, what the people are doing is evil and wrong, and it's not getting better. In fact, the translators in a couple of places actually have cleaned up the Hebrew so we can read it. Because it doesn't, we'll get there and I'll tell you. Anyway, we stopped last time in the middle of Isaiah, where Isaiah's prophesying about the coming King Manasseh administration, or he's addressing them directly. Now, I tend to think he's addressing them directly and prophesying at the same time, because Manasseh was so impressed with him, he had him sawed in half. So that's what I think is going on. But Manasseh winds up being the worst king in the history of Judah. There is nobody who's worse than he is. Yet, at the end of his life, he repented and came back to the Lord. And he becomes an example of what you can be when you give your life to the Lord after you've been living a life that has been doing other things. But for the 50 years of his life where he was not following the Lord, the name of the game in Judah was idolatry, infanticide, and cancellation of temple worship. And if anybody dared to stand for Yahweh, they were going to get canceled too. And usually with prejudice. In other words, they were sawn in half, they were taken out and killed. It was not a great place to live for the Lord at the time. As we began Isaiah 57, we learned that the Lord rescues those who love him and removes them before judgment falls, which is strangely reminiscent of what's going to happen when the Lord raptures the church. We're being removed before anything happens. Then we find out about those who are really running the show, or at least they thought they were running the show. Okay, we're talking about the religious leaders and those who think that they're absolutely doing everything that they can, working with the people of Judah. So we find out who's running the show, and they're going to find out who really is running the show. And Yahweh is the one who's really running the show. Now, again, from a high altitude, we need to take a look at the outline of Isaiah, simply because the contrast in Isaiah is, in this section here, is like looking at our culture today. It's really unusual. So as we looked at it last week, we saw an invitation to the nations to attack Judah, destroy them, followed by an indictment against the religious and civil leadership of Judah. That was in Isaiah 56, verses 9 to 12. Then we see the persecution of the faithful by the faithless in Isaiah 57:1. We see the removal of the faithful from the scene, and judgment starts. That's verse 2. And then the downward spiral of religious apostasy is outlined for us, and there is a turning towards the occult, there's a turning towards immorality and human trafficking for solutions. And in verse 4, it's mocking those who follow the Lord. Now, that's where we ended last week. Where we're picking up is in verse 5. And in verse 5, we're going to see support for immorality and connecting with nature. That's what's going on in Judah. We're going to see support by the administration for child sacrifice, abortion, and infanticide. And they're going to be worshiping nature and the things of the world in all these new locations, which are significant because they point to some of the beliefs that they actually have at that time. We're going to see trade and diplomacy with multiple countries begin to happen because they're looking for political protection from other nations because they don't have an army that's big enough to protect themselves from the Assyrian Empire. And then we're going to see the memorialization of immorality and false worship even in their homes, where they're going to set up and allow not only images of false gods, but they're going to be placing images of immorality and false gods in their home, and they're actually going to promote and use sexually oriented materials in their homes. This is actually in the scriptures here. In verse 9, we're going to see that they promote and participate in immorality internationally in the name of religion, creating an international coalition with other leaders and religions, which didn't work real well for them, especially when members of the other religions began to show up in Judah, and then they brought their idolatry. They changed the culture to promote political security, and Isaiah has already talked about that earlier. We'll talk about that. And they're going to double down on the change of the culture by adding in additional foreign practices, and read idolatry, to give themselves political security. Then we come to verse 11. Why? Why are they doing this? Well, it might be that they're going to need more reminders of their sin and punishment for that sin they're going to receive. The bottom line is when we get to verse 12 and 13, time is up. And we're getting a picture of what happened to Manasseh personally, but we're going to see false righteousness and justice will be displayed for everybody. Everything that they relied on is going to be totally useless, and they're going to see that. And only those who return to Yahweh will survive. So back to our text, at verse 5 of chapter 57, Isaiah continues to discuss the lifestyle of those who are following the leadership of King Manasseh. He's the new king. He's the son of King Hezekiah, who has passed away. And what we see is a nation that sees righteousness as a result of the fact that they do these things in the temple. I'm righteous because I sacrifice. I'm righteous because I'm Jewish. I'm righteous because I do, in other words, I do this stuff and then I'm righteous because I do that stuff. It's not because they know the Lord. Here's the thing. They're making sure that they go to temple every so often. Not every week, but every so often. They make their nod to God. They'll run up and light a candle really quick and then leave. But that candle, as long as it burns, they're praying. That sounds awful familiar when I say that, like another group of folks today. They would run in and take a worn-out bull or a goat to sacrifice it, and they'd save the best for themselves for a barbecue later on. They'd tip God, and that got so bad that Malachi talked about it in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. Then they run off and do what they really want to do. And as you start studying it, it sounds an awful lot like what Jesus is talking about in Revelation chapter 3, verses 14 to 22, when he starts talking about the church at Laodicea. They think they got it all together, and they don't have it all together. Not at all. These are people who believe they're good to go spiritually because they're born in Judah. They live in the promised land. God is only interested in their religious life, and he's not interested in anything else that they do. Isaiah has been talking about that since chapter 1, and he's still talking about it. God has a totally different view than they do. And he starts up with his view in the latter part of verse 4, so we'll pick up there. And this is the Lord speaking. Are you not children of rebellion, offspring of deceit, who inflame yourselves among the oaks under every luxuriant tree, who slaughter the children in the ravines under the clefts of the rocks? Among the smooth stones of the ravine is your portion. They're your lot. Even to them you've poured out a drink offering, and you've made a grain offering. Should I relent of these things? We'll stop there. Those who have rejected Yahweh have first of all given themselves over to a lifestyle of promiscuity. That's what's being talked about here at the very beginning. And they're very public about it. Is Isaiah going to go out of his way to give us the grosser highlights of their pagan life? Oh yes, he is. And the translator has actually cleaned up the Hebrew to keep it G-rated. Okay? Most of the nation was embracing a worldview that was inconsistent with being a faithful follower of Yahweh. We've talked about that is characteristic of the nation today, where you've got 67%, 62% of the United States says, oh yes, we're Christians, but only 6% actually have a Christian worldview. That's a big, wide difference. It's not dissimilar than what we see today. Solomon was right. There's nothing new under the sun. There have been numerous comments made about the acceleration of people leaving the church because of the pandemic. The dirty truth is they were on the way out anyhow. It just accelerated things. Well, this is going on in Judah too, in 700 BC. The nation was already leaving Yahweh. Just because King Hezekiah died and his son came in and he made evil politically correct, it accelerated it. That's all. In the scriptures, there are two things that the prophets all agree on and were disgusted with. The first are the pagan fertility rites that the nation would bring in from Babylon and from Egypt and from Acadia and all these different countries that surrounded them. And child sacrifice. Now, we don't call them that today. We don't call what some people do a fertility rite, but the behavior and the practice is not a lot different. The same fallen ones that were behind what was going on in 700 BC are the same fallen ones who are behind all of it today. They haven't changed their tactic. They've just kind of moved it up to the 21st century, but in reality, the things that they're doing have not changed. We think we're modern because we couch everything that's going on in other terms. We use words like choice, hookups, friends with benefits, women's health, or even the word love. But when the word love is used, they're using the Greek word eros, which means sexual love. They're not using the word agapeo or phileo, which is love no matter what, or brotherly love. They're not using that. They're meaning something entirely different. I mean, in fact, they even say, well, love is love. No, why don't you just say what you really mean? Lust is lust. Because that's what it is in many cases. The prophet Hosea referred to these lifestyle choice problems in Israel and Judah in Hosea chapter 4. There he says, at sacred places on the mountaintops, talking about the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, they offer sacrifices. And on the hills they burn incense under tall spreading trees because the shade's so pleasant. As a result, your daughters serve as prostitutes, and your daughters-in-law commit adultery. Yet I won't punish them for this because you yourselves go off with temple prostitutes, and together with them you offer pagan sacrifices. As the proverb says, a people without sense will be ruined. Hosea didn't spare any concerns about that. He laid it all out. He wanted to make sure they knew. And Hosea is not the only one. Once the people go into exile, they just knew because Yahweh was going to, he loved them and he put them in the promised land. He was going to rescue them and take them out of Babylon and send them right back home immediately. And Ezekiel's reminding them, no, you're here for a reason. Buy a house, move in, enjoy your new life. In Ezekiel 16, Starting in verse 15, Ezekiel says, "But you trusted in your beauty and capitalized on your fame by becoming a prostitute. You offered your sexual favors to every man who passed by, so that your beauty became his. You took some of your clothing and made for yourself decorated high places. You engaged in prostitution on them, and you went to him to become his. You also took your beautiful jewelry made of my gold and my silver I'd given to you, and made for yourself male images and engaged in prostitution with them. You took your embroidered clothing and used it to cover them. You offered my olive oil and my incense to them. As for my food that I gave you, the fine flour, the olive oil, and honey I fed you, you placed it before them as a soothing aroma." That's exactly what happened, declares the sovereign Lord. "You took your sons and your daughters, who you bore to me, and you sacrificed them as food for the idols to eat. As if your prostitution's not enough, you slaughtered my children and sacrificed them to the idols." I think Ezekiel's pretty plain and clear. And he's talking about things that are going on, Ezekiel is, in 550 BC. Isaiah's in 700. It didn't get better. Yeah, we do understand that the Bible teaches that idolatry is the same as religious prostitution, but the worship of Middle Eastern fertility gods did involve prostitution, both male and female. In ancient fertility rites, the devotees would engage in sexual intercourse with the shrine prostitute, and by means of doing this, and they would use, there was some kind of magic involved, it would ensure that the land and its creatures would have a very fruitful year. The crops would grow, their animals would have calves or baby goats or whatever, and it was all because they engaged in sex with a prostitute who was working on behalf of Baal. And because of that, the shrine prostitutes in most of the nations around Israel were highly respected because of their supposed role in bringing prosperity to the land. Now, Hezekiah, when he took over, he had them all executed. So did Josiah. Every time there's a revival, those are the first ones to go. The latter prophets, now we're talking about the prophets starting with Isaiah and all the guys after him, protested against Israel's sexual immorality on the social level and then the metaphorical adultery and harlotry on the national level. But in reality, it was the immoral sexual practices that they performed in the worshiping Baal and Molech and all of them that called forth the denunciations that God gave them. They were breaches of God's covenant, yes, but it also struck right at the reason why they were there. They were supposed to be pointing the nations to Yahweh. They weren't. Not at all. The picture that's being drawn for us here in Isaiah is how pervasive this all became in the culture. And they became worse than those that they kicked out under Joshua. There was no shame as to what they were doing. It was out in the open, under the trees, on the hills. They didn't care. Well, we don't do that today, right? Yeah. Now we have entertainments available online, in theaters, on television, where we can vicariously participate in the actions taking place on the screen. It's a gateway for the enemy to infiltrate almost every home in the world now that engages in watching this type of entertainment. The Bible's pretty consistent. It calls it sin. That's what it is. We don't have to go to a tree where there's a false god. Now we can bring it into our living room and watch. Jesus provided us direction for those who are believers and living for him, how we should live in the kingdom. The already but not yet method that we should be living. I mean, the kingdom's not yet, but we are his believers, we are his followers, we are members of that kingdom. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us how we're supposed to live. Now, that sermon is God's picture, it's his commentary on what the Torah actually meant. So if you want to know what the Torah meant, Jesus begins to give us a commentary on that. The standards that Jesus presents are very different when contrasted to the culture of 30 AD Israel and 21st century United States and world. He spoke about the root causes of sin in that sermon. This is what it causes, and it was a little further down the road than what the Pharisees even thought. They said, well, you can do this, and Jesus said, no, this starts it. By extension, some of the entertainment selections actually fell into various places in that sermon. One is in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. There, Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. That's what it said in the Torah. It said that. But I say to you, this is Jesus saying, here's where it begins. Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Job had the same issue. Now, Job is the oldest book in the Bible. He wrote this about 200 years after the flood. Abram may not even have been born yet when Job is writing. And he talks about dealing with it in Job chapter 31, verses 1 to 12. He says, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look with lust at a young woman. For what has God above chosen for us? What is our inheritance from the Almighty on high? Isn't it calamity for the wicked and misfortune for those who do evil? Doesn't he see everything I do and every step I take? Have I lied to anyone or deceived anyone? Let God weigh me on the scales of justice, for he knows my integrity. If I've strayed from his pathway, or if my heart has lusted for what my eyes have seen, or if I'm guilty of any other sin, let someone else eat the crops I've planted. Let all that I've planted be uprooted. If my heart has been seduced by a woman, or if I've lusted for my neighbor's wife, then let my wife serve another man, and let another man sleep with her. For lust is a shameful sin, a crime that should be punished. It's a fire that burns all the way to hell. It would wipe out everything I own. And we've seen that happen to folks who say that they're pastors when they get caught, and it costs them everything, everything. Job is saying, well, if he does that, it's going to cost him everything. And the thing that's interesting is this is 28 chapters after his wife told him, curse God and die. He still loves his wife. He's not going to do anything to destroy that or upset that, even though she's got a little different viewpoint of what's going on to him at this point than he does. We all need to join with Job and assess what it is that we watch or that we decide that we want to look at. Now, I get it. I mean, every time I get a 995 and I start driving north or I start driving south, once you get to about the third or fourth billboard sign, I don't want to see it anymore. I mean, I'd love to find a way to get around the major intersection where there's a certain steak restaurant that does other things too, where I don't have to see their signs because I don't want to see their signs. We want to guard what we see. We want to make sure that we don't find, and it's thrown at us constantly by the culture. Our culture's gone crazy with sex. Have you picked up on that? That's not new. Job was talking about that a long time ago. We're not the first. It's an attack vector that the enemy uses because it works. And he's not going to change anything if it works. If it doesn't, he'll change. But everything that he uses has worked for thousands of years. Why should he change?
You've been listening to a message from Isaiah on the UnSafe Bible. Pastor Ken has been diving deep into this major prophet to help us all understand how to apply these messages to our lives today. Well, as we see here in Isaiah, the whole scope and sequence of the life of Jesus, from the announcement of his birth to the second coming, the time he'll return for his people, for all those redeemed by his blood. This book is like a person crying out into a busy street, desperately needing to be heard. God is our one true salvation. Isaiah encourages his readers to trust and believe in God because it's God who dispels the darkness that comes from a sin-filled world. If you have questions about today's message or you just want to hear more, don't hesitate to contact us. You can get in touch with us by going to the unsafebible.com. Once there, use the Connect tab and click on Connect Card. Just fill out the form and we'll reach out to you. Remember to listen to other teachings from Pastor Ken. Just look under the Media tab at the unsafebible.com. If you found this ministry to be a blessing to you as you've been listening, you can show us your support for the Unsafe Bible ministry by checking out the Give tab. No gift is too big or too small, and will help us continue to reach the lost with God's Word. We're based out of Jupiter, Florida, and want to invite you to join us in person for the next service. All the information you need to come is found at theunsafebible.com. Until then, we want to thank you for joining us right here on the Unsafe Bible.